I am William Crawford, 70 years old and a retired structural engineer who spent the last 12 years building water infrastructure in Africa. I endured the grueling heat and harsh conditions for one reason: to build an empire for my only son, Leo. When I finally came home unannounced to the $3.2 million Montana ranch I bought for him, I expected a warm welcome. Instead, I found him wearing rags, violently shoveling horse manure in the freezing wind. He did not even recognize me. He just flinched and begged me not to report him. That night, I booked a cheap motel room, called my corporate attorney, and began meticulously dismantling the lives of the people who destroyed my boy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's love means having the ruthless courage to tear down the very walls you built to protect your child. The grating rhythmic scrape of a rusty shovel against cold concrete is a sound I will never forget. It echoed through the freezing air of Bozeman, Montana, cutting sharply through the biting winter wind. I had just stepped out of a taxi at the front gates of the sprawling ranch I purchased 10 years ago. I did not tell anyone I was coming home. I wanted to surprise my family. After 12 years of living out of canvas duffel bags, leading engineering teams to build aqueducts across rural Kenya, I was finally ready to retire. I had survived malaria bouts, navigated corrupt local politics, and endured the relentless, blistering heat of the equator, all for a single purpose. I wanted to secure an unbreakable legacy for my son. I walked slowly up the long gravel driveway, my lungs burning as they adjusted to the sharp, thin mountain air. The property was massive, lined with pristine white fences and towering snow-dusted pine trees. It was supposed to be Leo's paradise. I bought this land as a wedding gift when he married Monica, providing a fresh start for a brilliant agricultural engineer who had so many beautiful dreams of running his own sustainable farm. I fully expected to see him riding across the open pasture, strong, healthy, and in charge of his destiny. Instead, my eyes were drawn to a frail figure hunched over near the horse stables. The man was painfully thin, his frame practically swallowed by a torn, grease-stained jacket that offered absolutely no protection against the bitter mountain chill. His beard was overgrown and matted, his hair greasy and wildly unkempt. He was violently shoveling horse manure into a rusted metal wheelbarrow, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. His bare hands were cracked and bleeding from the freezing cold. I felt a sudden, sharp twist of confusion and anger. I wondered why Leo would ever hire a vagrant and allow him to work in such inhumane conditions. I walked closer, intending to tap the man on the shoulder and ask where I could find the owner of the ranch. But as I closed the distance, the man turned his head just slightly to wipe his running nose on his frayed sleeve. My heart completely stopped. My breath caught in my throat like a jagged shard of glass. Beneath the layer of grime, beneath the overgrown, messy beard and the hollow, sunken cheeks, I saw a pale, crescent-shaped scar resting on his chin. It was the exact same scar my boy got when he was 7 years old, tumbling over the handlebars of his bicycle in our old suburban driveway. I felt a massive wave of dizziness wash over me, making the ground beneath my boots sway. This broken, shivering, emaciated shell of a human being was my son. It was Leo. I took a trembling, uncertain step forward. "Leo," I whispered. My voice broke, sounding weak and fragile in the vast emptiness of the property. "Leo, is that you?" He dropped the shovel. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the concrete floor, echoing like a gunshot. He spun around, his eyes wide and terribly dilated. But there was no sudden spark of recognition. There was no joy, no relief at seeing his father after so many years. There was only pure, unadulterated terror. He shrank back against the wooden stall, throwing his bruised arms up defensively over his face. He flinched, pulling his shoulders up to his ears, fully expecting me to strike him. "I am sorry, sir," he stammered. His voice was raspy, shaking uncontrollably as he pressed himself into the shadows of the barn. "I will clean it faster. I promise. Please do not report me. I am doing my best." He looked right through me. He looked at the man who had carried him on his shoulders as a toddler. The man who had stayed up late helping him with his college applications. The man who had wired millions of dollars across the ocean to secure his entire future, and he only saw a threat. He did not know I was his father. He was looking at me as if I were just another cruel master ready to punish him for a mistake. The pain that hit me in that moment was worse than anything I had ever experienced in my 70 years on this earth. It was a visceral, suffocating agony that tore right through my chest. I thought about the grueling, endless years I spent in Nairobi. I remembered working 16-hour days in the sweltering heat, sleeping in humid, mosquito-infested tents, and rationing my own meals just so I could send every spare dollar back to America. I did all of that so my son would never have to struggle for a single day in his life. I handed him a $3.2 million estate on a silver platter. I wanted him to be a king on his own land. And now he was standing before me looking like a hostage of war, begging a stranger for mercy while scooping animal waste. What kind of nightmare had my absence allowed to fester? What had happened to his bright, ambitious mind? I reached out my hand. I wanted to grab him, to hold him tight, to tell him that his dad was finally home, and that everything was going to be okay. "Leo, it is me," I said, taking another slow step into the stable. "It is your father." He just shook his head frantically, pressing his thin back harder against the freezing wood of the stall. "No, no, no," he muttered, his eyes darting around wildly in sheer panic. "Not allowed to talk. Not allowed to rest. Have to finish the stalls before she gets back." Before I could try to calm him down, the loud, aggressive crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the tension in the barn. A brand-new, gleaming black Mercedes G-Wagon sped up the path, coming to a sudden, arrogant halt just a few yards from where we stood. The powerful engine roared for a second before being cut off abruptly. The driver's side door swung open. Out stepped Monica, my daughter-in-law. She was draped in absolute, undeniable luxury. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat that practically glowed in the winter light, expensive leather designer boots, and carried a handbag that likely cost more than the average person makes in a year. She looked perfectly manicured, radiant, and dripping with wealth. Stepping out of the passenger side was a slickly dressed man I had never seen before. He wore a tailored suit and had the smug, entitled swagger of someone who believed he owned the entire world. Monica was laughing loudly at something the stranger said. She casually pulled down her oversized designer sunglasses, her perfect white teeth flashing in the cold sun. Then her eyes swept across the property and locked onto me, standing in the shadows of the stables. The laughter died instantly in her throat. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale as the snow around us. Her jaw dropped slightly. She was looking at the man who had funded her entire luxurious existence, standing right next to the husband she had somehow turned into a mindless, terrified slave. Monica froze for only a fraction of a second. I saw the sheer panic flash across her perfectly sculpted features, but before I could even process her shock, her entire demeanor shifted. The arrogant, laughing woman vanished instantly, replaced by a tragic, long-suffering wife. She dropped her expensive handbag onto the freezing gravel, sprinted across the driveway, and threw her arms around my neck. "William," she sobbed, burying her face into my heavy winter coat. "Oh my God. William, you are finally home." Her tears felt entirely too practiced. Her wails echoed across the quiet ranch, loud and theatrical, as if she were performing for an invisible audience. I stood rigid, my hands resting awkwardly on her shoulders. Over her shoulder, I watched my son. Leo had retreated even further into the shadows of the stable, his trembling hands clutching his knees as he rocked back and forth on the concrete floor. He was deliberately making himself as small as possible. I gently pushed Monica back. "Monica, what is happening here?" I asked, my voice tight with a forced, trembling vulnerability. "Why does my son look like this? Why is he out here shoveling waste in the freezing cold? Why does he not know who I am?" She wiped her eyes, smudging her immaculate makeup just enough to look devastated. "William, it has been a living nightmare," she cried, clutching her chest. 3 years ago, Leo just snapped. He developed severe aggressive schizophrenia. The doctors said it was triggered by a massive, sudden psychological break. He turned to heavy narcotics to cope with the voices in his head. He became a completely different person. He was violent, paranoid, and completely out of control. He gambled away our savings and took out massive hidden loans. He nearly bankrupted the entire ranch before I even realized what was happening. I listened, keeping my face a mask of sorrowful shock. It took everything in me not to react, not to show the cold, calculating rage building inside my chest. She told me that to save the property from total foreclosure, Leo had willingly signed a complete power of attorney over to her during a rare moment of clarity. She painted herself as the ultimate martyr, the devoted wife who stayed to clean up the wreckage of a broken man. Then why is he working like a slave in the freezing cold? I asked, gesturing toward the barn. If he is sick, he belongs in a hospital, Monica, not out here. She shook her head frantically. The doctors insisted on this, William. They said institutionalizing him would only accelerate his mental decline. The manual labor is a strict doctor-mandated physical therapy. It exhausts him physically, so he cannot have his violent episodes at night. It is the only thing that keeps him grounded. Just then, the slickly dressed stranger sauntered over. He did not have the decency to look sympathetic. His posture was utterly relaxed, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored trousers. William, Monica sniffled, reaching out to touch the stranger's arm. This is Derek. He is a financial restructuring consultant. I had to hire him to help me untangle the massive web of debt Leo left us in. He has been an absolute angel, working tirelessly to negotiate with the banks so we do not lose your beautiful gift. Derek extended a manicured hand toward me. A pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Crawford, he said, his voice dripping with a smooth, practiced charm. Monica has told me so much about your humanitarian work. We are just doing damage control here, trying to keep the ship afloat. I slowly reached out and shook his hand. His grip was firm, arrogant, and entirely too confident. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken old man to absolute perfection. Oh, I see, I murmured, letting my shoulders slump, as if the weight of the tragedy had physically broken me. Thank you for helping my family, Derek. But inside, my instincts were screaming. I had spent over a decade sitting at negotiation tables with warlords, corrupt government officials, and ruthless smugglers across the African continent. I knew how to read the subtle, silent language of human deception. My mind immediately began dissecting the massive holes in their story. If the ranch was truly on the verge of total bankruptcy, how could Monica afford to drive a brand new Mercedes SUV? How could she afford a pure cashmere coat? And more importantly, as she wiped her fake tears, the winter sun caught the edge of her wrist. She was wearing a diamond-studded Cartier watch that easily cost $15,000. People drowning in foreclosure do not wear Cartier. But the most damning piece of evidence was not Monica's jewelry. It was my son. As Derek had stepped closer to us, I watched Leo's reaction from the corner of my eye. A man suffering from general schizophrenia might be unpredictable or detached. But Leo was not detached. He was terrified. When Derek's shadow fell across the barn entrance, Leo violently trembled, dropping his chin to his chest like a beaten dog bracing for a swift kick. That was not mental illness. That was conditioned systematic abuse. I need to see him, I said, taking a step toward the barn. I need to take him inside the main house and get him warm. I can help you care for him, Monica. I am home for good now. Monica immediately blocked my path, her eyes widening in genuine panic. No, William, please, you cannot. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. The psychiatrist was very clear about his routine. New faces, even family members he has forgotten, trigger his most dangerous violent episodes. If you go in that main house, he will shatter everything. He might even hurt you. We have a highly structured environment in the house right now. You cannot stay there. It is simply not safe for you or for him. She was effectively banishing me from the very home I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. I need to keep him isolated until his medication stabilizes, she pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate, high-pitched whine. Derek nodded in solemn agreement. She is right, Mr. Crawford. We cannot risk a setback. There is a decent motel down in the valley. I can have my driver take you there. You can rest, and we can discuss a safe visitation plan tomorrow. I looked at Monica, then at Derek, and finally at the dark barn where my son was shivering in the dirt. I swallowed my pride, forcing tears to well up in my own eyes. You are right, I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured defeat. I do not want to make things worse for my boy. I will go to the motel. I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the driveway, playing the broken, helpless old man. But the moment I was out of their sight, the grieving father died. I pulled my winter coat tight against the cold, preparing to tear down the empire I had painstakingly built. The crunch of gravel beneath my heavy winter boots faded as I reached the main road leading away from the ranch. I walked for nearly a mile in the freezing mountain wind before I managed to flag down a passing cab. I directed the driver to a rundown, deeply unappealing motel I had spotted on the absolute edge of town. It cost exactly $40 a night. The room smelled overwhelmingly of stale cigarettes, cheap industrial bleach, and damp carpet. The faded floral bedspread was thin and worn through at the corners. It was a stark, almost laughable contrast to the plush white cashmere and diamond-studded luxury Monica had just flaunted in my face. But I did not care about physical comfort right now. I did not need luxury. I needed a secure, isolated operational base where no one would ever think to look for me. The moment I turned the rusted deadbolt on that flimsy wooden door, the fragile persona of the broken, grieving father completely evaporated from my body. My hunched posture straightened immediately. The manufactured trembling in my cold hands ceased. I was no longer a helpless old man crying in the dirt. I walked over to the small, scratched desk in the corner of the room, unzipped my heavy canvas duffel bag, and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I booted up the computer, established a secure network connection, and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the private emergency number of Victor Reed. Victor was my corporate attorney, a man widely known and deeply feared for his absolute ruthlessness in a courtroom. He had managed all my domestic assets and legal shielding while I was drilling deep water wells and building massive concrete aqueducts in Kenya. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he answered the line on the second ring. I did not waste a single second with polite pleasantries. I told him exactly what I had just witnessed at the Bozeman estate. I described my son shivering in the dirt, the obvious and heavy chemical sedation, keeping him docile, the slickly dressed man masquerading as a financial consultant, and Monica's utterly ridiculous theatrical tale of impending foreclosure and crushing debt. I gave Victor explicit, uncompromising orders. I demanded a covert, full-scale forensic audit of the entire estate. I needed every public and private record attached to the property pulled immediately. I wanted Monica's personal bank accounts and credit lines ripped open and scrutinized. I wanted a complete invasive background check on the man calling himself Derek. Victor did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer useless sympathy. He recognized the cold, lethal tone in my voice. He simply promised to deploy his entire investigative team immediately and told me to wait for his call. The next 2 hours were absolutely excruciating. I paced the narrow, suffocating span of the motel room, staring blankly at the peeling yellow wallpaper. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind flashed right back to the pale, crescent-shaped scar on Leo's chin. My only son was currently a prisoner on his own land. He was trapped in a chemical cage designed and maintained by the very woman who had stood at an altar and sworn to love him. I channeled that agonizing, suffocating pain into a cold, highly focused rage. I had spent my entire career engineering massive, complex structures designed to withstand devastating earthquakes and catastrophic floods. I knew exactly how to find the critical weak point in any foundation. Monica's entire luxurious existence was a foundation built entirely on arrogant lies, and I was going to locate the exact stress point required to make it all violently collapse. Finally, my cell phone vibrated heavily against the cheap laminate nightstand. I picked it up. It was Victor. His tone was remarkably grim, stripped of its usual unshakable confidence. "William," he said, his voice low and serious, "I have the preliminary reports. You need to brace yourself. The ranch is nowhere near bankruptcy. It is the exact opposite." Victor revealed the explosive truth. A private, highly confidential geological survey conducted 8 months ago had discovered a massive, highly concentrated lithium deposit lying directly beneath the southern pastures of the property. The rare mineral vein was vast and incredibly lucrative. Because of this discovery, the estate had recently been quietly appraised at a staggering $15 million. The sheer scale of the deception temporarily took my breath away. Monica was not drowning in debt. She was sitting on a literal gold mine, manipulating the narrative to ensure she maintained absolute, uncontested control over the land. But Victor was not finished delivering the bad news. The situation was escalating rapidly. He revealed that the slick stranger I had met in the driveway was absolutely not a financial restructuring consultant. His actual name was Derek, a man with a deeply problematic background. He was a disgraced, highly corrupt commercial real estate broker with a notorious history of executing predatory land acquisitions and dodging federal indictments. Derek and Monica had not been negotiating with banks to save the farm. They had already drafted the final binding legal paperwork to sell the entire $3.2 million property, along with its newly discovered $15 million mineral rights, to a massive international mining conglomerate. They were bypassing standard market listings entirely to keep the transaction hidden from public view. Victor had managed to access the preliminary transfer filings through a backdoor channel. The final closing signatures were explicitly scheduled to take place this upcoming Friday night. Monica was intentionally hosting a lavish, fully catered event at the main house under the public guise of celebrating the ranch's 10th anniversary. In reality, that glittering gala was a private, highly exclusive closing party tailored specifically for the mining executives. They were going to wear expensive suits, pop imported champagne, and legally sign away my son's entire future while he remained locked outside shoveling animal manure in the freezing dark. They thought they had constructed the perfect foolproof crime. They had incapacitated the legal owner, established a fraudulent power of attorney, and isolated the property from anyone who might ask difficult questions. They truly believed they had already won. I thanked Victor for his rapid, flawless work and hung up the phone. The room was perfectly silent save for the low buzzing hum of the ancient motel refrigerator. I looked closely at the glowing digital clock resting on the corner of my laptop screen. It was currently Wednesday afternoon. The closing gala was scheduled for Friday night. I had less than 48 hours to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar conspiracy, expose a corrupt real estate broker, and save my boy from a heavily medicated nightmare. I did not feel panic. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute chilling clarity of a man who suddenly had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. I closed my laptop and walked over to the small, cloudy window overlooking the desolate motel parking lot. The cold winter sun was setting. Monica and Derek thought they were apex predators. They would soon learn a permanent lesson about underestimating a father. The digital clock on the cheap motel nightstand clicked to 2 in the morning. I refused to sit idle while my son remained locked in a freezing barn. I unpacked the black thermal clothing I brought for the brutal winter. I dressed quickly in the dark, slipping on a face mask and tactical gloves. I left the room, stepping into the biting wind, and climbed into my rental sedan. I drove out of town until the road turned into pitch-black asphalt, cutting through thick pine forests. I knew the property layout intimately. I had overseen the original installation of the security systems. The main gate had motion sensors and license plate readers. If I drove anywhere near the front entrance, Monica and Derek would be alerted instantly. I parked the car on a hidden logging road exactly 3 miles from the dark ranch perimeter. I locked the doors, turned up my collar, and began the grueling hike through the dense woods. The deep snow crunched softly beneath my boots with every step. At 70, my stiff joints ached with the intense cold, and the elevation made my lungs burn. but the physical pain was overshadowed by the relentless fury driving me forward. I navigated entirely by memory and the faint glow of the moonlight reflecting off the snow. After an hour of silent trekking, the silhouette of the horse stables emerged from the darkness. I crept along the tree line, keeping pressed flat against the wooden exterior of the barn. I reached the side door, pulling a penlight from my pocket. The heavy padlock was secured, but I had designed these stalls myself. I knew the structural bypass. I slid steel wire behind the latch plate and popped the secondary bolt free. I slipped inside, closing the door soundlessly. The interior of the barn was painfully cold. There was no heating system active, and the air smelled heavily of damp straw and freezing dust. I moved down the main corridor, my boots making absolutely no sound on the concrete. At the end of the row inside the last stall, I found him. Leo was curled tightly into a shivering ball on a filthy, stained mattress thrown directly onto the ground. He was wrapped in a tattered, moving blanket that provided virtually no warmth. I knelt beside him, clicking off my penlight to let my eyes adjust to the shadows. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. I gently pulled the edge of the blanket away from his chest to cover his exposed shoulders. As the fabric shifted, his left arm fell limply onto the mattress. The moonlight filtering through the high barn windows caught the surface of his skin. I felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. I turned my penlight on the lowest setting and shielded the beam with my palm. The inside of his forearm was covered in a dense cluster of deep purple bruises and fresh puncture marks. The horrifying truth hit me with absolute certainty. My boy was not suffering from a sudden drug addiction. He was not a willing participant in his own destruction. He was a prisoner being systematically, chemically paralyzed against his will. The heavy sedation was designed to keep him weak, confused, and utterly compliant. Tears of absolute blinding rage blurred my vision, but I swallowed them down. I could not afford to be emotional. I reached into my vest and retrieved 2 micro-audio transmitters I always carried for high-risk negotiations in Nairobi. They were no larger than a standard coin, equipped with long-lasting batteries and powerful microphones. I leaned in close to my son and placed a gentle hand on his shivering forehead. "Leo," I whispered softly into his ear. "Leo, wake up for just a second." His eyelids fluttered open, glassy and terribly unfocused. The heavy sedatives were dragging him down like an anchor. He looked at me, but his mind was trapped in a terrifying chemically induced fog. He did not recognize me. He thought I was part of his nightmare. He weakly grabbed my wrist, his fingers cold and trembling. "Do not let them take the family land," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperate exhaustion. "Please." I told them no. I will not sign the final release. Tell him I held on. Tell my dad I tried. His eyes rolled back and he slipped instantly back into a deep, unnatural unconsciousness. Hearing those words completely shattered my heart, but it also reignited the fire in my soul. Even buried under massive doses of illicit tranquilizers, my son was fighting. He was refusing to sign away the final deed release, desperately trying to protect the legacy I had given him. He was holding the line. Now it was my turn to bring the war to them. I carefully lifted the corner of his mattress and wedged the first microtransmitter deep inside the lining where it would never be found. I pulled his blanket up tight around his neck, kissed his cold forehead, and promised him I would be back. I stood up and slipped silently out of the barn, securing the latch behind me. I moved like a ghost across the open, freezing courtyard toward the towering silhouette of the main house. The massive luxury home was completely dark, save for a single security light illuminating the back patio. I knew the architectural blueprints of this house better than anyone. I moved carefully toward the bay windows of the ground floor home office, staying completely hidden in the deep shadows of the evergreen bushes. I knelt beside the exterior ventilation grate that fed directly into the office heating system. I used a small multi-tool to quietly remove the 2 screws holding the metal cover in place. I reached my arm deep into the dusty, insulated ductwork and firmly attached the second microtransmitter to the inner metal wall, using its magnetic backing. This bug would pick up every single conversation, every hushed phone call, and every dark secret whispered inside that room. I carefully replaced the grate and tightened the screws, brushing away the metallic dust to ensure everything looked completely undisturbed. I wiped away my footprints in the snow using a pine branch and retreated back into the dense tree line. Just as I merged into the shadows of the forest, a heavy flashlight beam swept across the courtyard. A hired private security guard stepped around the corner of the main house, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. He wore a tactical jacket and carried a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He walked a slow, lazy perimeter, pausing directly in front of the heavy barn door, where I had been standing just minutes ago. He shined his light through the cracks in the wood, grunted in satisfaction, and continued his patrol toward the front gate. I held my breath, standing perfectly still in the dense, freezing brush until his heavy footsteps faded completely into the howling wind. I turned and began the agonizing 3-mile hike back to my rental car, my body exhausted, but my mind racing with lethal clarity. The board was finally set. The clock clicked to 2 in the morning. I pulled out the winter gear I had packed. I dressed quickly, layering thermal wool under a weather-resistant shell. I pulled a mask over my face and strapped on insulated gloves. I stepped into the freezing motel parking lot. The biting wind lashed against my skin, sharpening my focus. I drove out of town, cautiously navigating the snow-covered roads without high beams. I knew the perimeter layout of my ranch better than the original contractors. I parked on a logging road exactly 3 miles from the western boundary. I locked the doors and stepped into the silent pine forest. The hike was brutal. The snow was knee-deep and every step required immense effort. At 70 years old, my joints ached terribly with the cold, and the elevation made my lungs burn. But the physical pain was overshadowed by the relentless fury driving me forward. I navigated the dense woods by memory and faint moonlight. After an agonizing hour of trekking, the dark silhouette of the horse stables emerged. I crept along the forest edge, keeping my back pressed flat against the wooden exterior of the barn. I reached the side entrance and pulled a small penlight from my pocket. A heavy padlock secured the door, but I knew exactly how to bypass the internal mechanism. I pulled a thin piece of steel wire from my pocket, slid it behind the latch plate, and popped the secondary bolt free. I slipped inside, plunging myself into suffocating darkness. The interior of the barn was painfully cold. I moved very slowly down the central corridor, placing my boots carefully to make no sound on the concrete floor. I held my breath. Inside the last stall, I finally found him. Leo was curled into a shivering ball on a filthy mattress thrown directly onto the frozen dirt floor. He was wrapped in a single tattered blanket that provided virtually no warmth against the winter drafts. I knelt slowly beside him, clicking my penlight onto its lowest setting and shielding the beam. His breathing was shallow, marked by weak, ragged gasps. I gently pulled the frayed edge of the blanket away from his chest. His left arm fell limply. The pale moonlight filtering through the high barn windows caught the exposed surface of his skin. I felt my stomach drop into a sickening pit. I moved my shielded penlight closer. His arm was covered in a horrifying cluster of deep purple bruises and fresh puncture marks. The devastating truth hit me with the crushing force of a speeding freight train. My boy was not suffering from a sudden drug addiction. He was a prisoner being systematically chemically paralyzed against his will. The heavy sedation was designed to keep him weak, confused, and utterly compliant, so they could steal his empire. Hot tears of blinding rage blurred my vision, but I forced myself to swallow the raw emotion down. I could not afford to be weak right now. I reached into my tactical vest and retrieved 2 micro-audio transmitters. I always carried these tiny devices for high-risk negotiations in Nairobi. They were no larger than a standard coin equipped with long-lasting batteries and incredibly powerful microphones. I leaned in close to my son and placed a gentle hand on his shivering, feverish forehead. "Leo," I whispered softly into his ear, my voice barely carrying over the howling winter wind outside. "Leo, please wake up for just 1 second." His eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, and swimming in a thick chemical fog. The heavy sedatives were dragging his mind down like a massive lead anchor. He looked right at me, but his broken brain was trapped in a terrifying hallucination. He did not recognize his own father. He weakly grabbed my wrist, his trembling fingers feeling like absolute ice. "Do not let them take the family land," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperate, heartbreaking exhaustion. "Please." I told them, "No, I will not sign the final release. Tell him I held on. Tell my dad I tried. I really tried to be strong." His eyes rolled back into his head, and his grip went slack as he slipped instantly back into a deep unconsciousness. Hearing those words shattered my heart, but it also reignited a lethal, unstoppable fire in my soul. Even buried under massive doses of tranquilizers, my son was fiercely fighting. He was flatly refusing to sign away the final deed release. He was desperately trying to protect the legacy I had given him. He was holding the line in the dark. Now it was my turn to bring the war directly to their doorstep. I carefully lifted the top corner of his dirty mattress and wedged the first microtransmitter deep inside the thick fabric lining. I pulled his blanket up tight around his neck, kissed his freezing forehead, and silently promised him I would absolutely burn this nightmare to the ground. I stood up and slipped silently out of the barn, securely locking the heavy steel latch behind me. I moved like a phantom across the freezing courtyard toward the towering silhouette of the main house. The massive home was dark, save for a single security floodlight. I knew the complex architectural blueprints of this house flawlessly. I moved carefully toward the large bay windows of the ground floor home office, staying hidden within the deep shadows of the thick evergreen bushes. I knelt beside the exterior metal ventilation grate that fed directly into the main office heating system. I used a small multi-tool to quietly remove the 2 steel screws holding the heavy cover in place. I reached my arm deep into the insulated ductwork and firmly attached the second microtransmitter to the inner metal wall using its strong magnetic backing. This hidden bug would pick up every single conversation, every hushed phone call, and every dark secret whispered inside that room. I carefully replaced the grate and tightened the screws. I wiped away my deep footprints in the snow using a fallen pine branch and retreated back into the dense tree line. Just as my body merged into the dark shadows of the forest, a bright flashlight beam swept violently across the courtyard. A hired private security guard stepped around the corner of the main house, his heavy winter boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel path. He wore a thick tactical jacket and carried a hunting rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He walked a slow perimeter check, pausing directly in front of the heavy wooden barn door, where I had been standing just minutes ago. He shined his bright light through the cracks in the wood, grunted in apparent satisfaction, and continued his routine patrol toward the front gate. I held my breath, standing perfectly still in the dense, freezing brush until his heavy footsteps faded completely into the howling winter wind. I turned and began the agonizing 3-mile hike back through the deep snow to my rental car. My body was entirely exhausted, but my mind was racing with absolute lethal clarity. The board was finally set. The morning sun brought a blinding glare across the snow, but it did nothing to warm the freezing chill that had settled deep into my bones. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, mentally rehearsing every single move I was about to make. Anger is a powerful fuel, but uncontrolled, it burns the very person wielding it. I needed absolute clinical precision. I picked up my phone and dialed Monica. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice tight with artificial sweetness. I let out a dry, rattling cough before speaking. I told her that my brief visit to the ranch had completely exhausted me. I claimed the mountain altitude was wreaking havoc on my aging lungs after so many years in the dense African heat. I asked if she and Derek would meet me for a quiet lunch in town, far away from the ranch, so as not to disturb Leo. I framed it as a necessary conversation about the future, heavily implying that my health was failing rapidly. She agreed immediately, likely eager to assess just how much of a threat I truly posed to their $15 million payday. We agreed to meet at an upscale steakhouse in the center of Bozeman at noon. I arrived 20 minutes early. I chose a secluded booth in the back corner of the restaurant, draped in dark leather and heavy shadows. I needed them to feel secure, isolated, and entirely in control of the narrative. I ordered a glass of hot water with lemon, deliberately skipping the expensive wine menu. When Monica and Derek finally walked through the polished oak doors, they looked like absolute royalty. Monica wore a tailored wool blazer over a silk blouse, her diamond earrings catching the dim restaurant lighting. Derek walked a half step behind her, exuding that same arrogant, predatory confidence I had seen in the driveway. They slid into the booth across from me. I did not sit up straight. I allowed my shoulders to slump heavily against the cushioned backing. I kept my hands slightly trembling as I lifted my glass of water. I let out another deep, wet cough, pulling a handkerchief from my pocket and pressing it to my mouth. "William, you look terrible," Monica said. Her tone was laced with fake sympathy, but her eyes were cold, scanning my face for any sign of suspicion or hidden motives. "The climate here is just too harsh for me now," I replied, keeping my voice faint and raspy. 12 years in Kenya takes a heavy toll on a man's body. The malaria comes back in waves, and my heart simply cannot handle the extreme cold anymore. I think my time here in America needs to be very short. I just wanted to see my boy one last time before my health completely gives out. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. "It is a tragedy, William, but you should find comfort in knowing that Monica is handling everything flawlessly. She has sacrificed her entire life to manage Leo's devastating illness. You can return to Africa knowing your son is in the best possible hands." I nodded slowly, letting a heavy, sorrowful sigh escape my lips. "That is exactly what I wanted to talk to you both about today." I looked directly at Monica, allowing a fragile, grateful smile to touch my face. "I saw how much you are suffering, Monica. I saw the terrible toll this horrible situation has taken on you. You could have walked away when Leo lost his mind. You could have divorced him and left the ranch to the banks, but you stayed. You stayed in the freezing dark to protect my son." Monica lowered her eyes, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. She was playing the martyr flawlessly. "I love him, William. I made a solemn vow. It has been a terrible nightmare, but I would never abandon my husband." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because of your incredible devotion, I have made a major decision regarding my estate. I am 70 years old, and my doctors have made it very clear that my remaining time is incredibly short. I am rewriting my final will this week." I paused, letting out another calculated raspy cough. When I was building infrastructure for the government in Nairobi, I established a private offshore trust fund in the Cayman Islands. It was entirely separate from my domestic accounts. It currently holds exactly $5 million in untaxed liquid cash. Derek actually stopped breathing. I saw his eyes widen, his pupils dilating with sudden, uncontrollable greed. Monica's hand gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. "I intend to name you as the sole uncontested beneficiary of that entire trust, Monica," I said softly. "I want to reward your absolute loyalty. You deserve to be heavily compensated for everything you have endured. When I pass away, which will likely be very soon, that $5 million will transfer directly into your personal accounts, completely tax-free." The silence at the table was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in their treacherous minds. They were mentally adding $5 million to the $15 million they were about to steal from the ranch sale. $20 million. It was a sum so massive it completely short-circuited their natural paranoia. They were no longer looking at a potential threat. They were looking at a dying cash cow that had just wandered directly into their slaughterhouse. "Oh, William," Monica gasped, reaching across the table to grab my trembling hands. Her grip was feverish. "I do not know what to say. I do not do this for the money. I do it for love. But your profound generosity, it would change everything. It would absolutely secure Leo's medical care forever. Derek quickly chimed in, his arrogant facade replaced by a sickening, eager subservience. It is a brilliant way to ensure your legacy, William. It protects the family. We can connect you with our legal team to expedite the paperwork if you need help processing the offshore transfers immediately. I smiled weakly. My attorney, Victor Reed, is flying in tomorrow to finalize the documents. I just need to survive the weekend, and then I will book a flight back to a warmer climate. I cannot bear to watch my son suffer anymore. It is simply too painful for a dying father to witness. Monica squeezed my hands tighter. Her eyes were burning with blinding, insatiable greed. You cannot leave yet, William. You must stay for the 10th anniversary gala at the main house this Friday night. It would mean the absolute world to me if you were there. We can celebrate your incredible legacy. We can celebrate our beautiful family. Derek nodded enthusiastically. It will be a private, elegant affair. We would be deeply honored to host you for the evening. They wanted to parade me around. They wanted the dying, clueless patriarch present to legitimize their standing, believing that keeping me close and happy would guarantee their $5 million payday. They wanted me to witness their triumph entirely unaware that they were actually inviting their own executioner into the room. I looked at their eager, greedy faces and offered them a warm, genuine smile. I would be absolutely delighted to attend, I whispered, letting my trembling hands gently pat Monica's fingers. The trap was perfectly set, and the final domino was now ready to fall, with devastating, unavoidable, and utterly catastrophic precision. The rest of Wednesday passed in a blur of calculated preparation. I returned to my cramped motel room and immediately called Victor Reed. I gave him a complete rundown of the lunch meeting and the trap I had successfully set. Monica and Derek were completely blinded by the promise of $5 million, which gave us the exact window of opportunity we needed. But I told Victor that our most pressing issue was not the impending land sale. It was my son. Leo was still trapped in that freezing barn, his veins flooded with illegal tranquilizers. We could not simply call the local police. A sudden police raid would give Monica the chance to destroy evidence, and worse, it would put Leo in the middle of a chaotic, highly dangerous situation while he was medically incapacitated. I needed a surgical strike. I instructed Victor to hire a covert private medical extraction team. I wanted the best trauma doctors money could buy, completely off the books, along with a discreet, private security detail. Victor assured me the team would be assembled and deployed by dawn. Thursday arrived with the heavy overcast sky. The freezing Montana air felt perfectly suited for what we were about to do. According to the surveillance schedule my investigators had quietly put together, the corrupt physician Dr. Evans visited the ranch every single afternoon at exactly 4:00 a.m. clock to administer Leo's daily dose of chemical restraints. We just needed Monica out of the way. As if the universe were finally aligning in our favor, my security team relayed a message at 2 in the afternoon. Monica had just driven out of the main gates in her Mercedes. She was heading into town for a final dress fitting for the Friday night gala. The estate was temporarily clear of its primary predator. I drove to the logging road and hiked through the woods, meeting Victor and his specialized team at the edge of the tree line. We waited in the freezing shadows, watching the rear service entrance near the stables. At 10 minutes to 4, a sleek silver sedan pulled up to the barn. A man stepped out carrying a black leather medical bag. He did not look like a healer. He looked like a smug, arrogant opportunist. He wore a heavy designer coat and walked with a brisk, unbothered pace toward the barn, fully prepared to inject my son with another round of debilitating poison. He never even made it to the door. 2 of Victor's massive private security operatives stepped out from the shadows of the tack room. They moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. Before Dr. Evans could even open his mouth to shout, they grabbed him by the arms, hoisted him off the ground, and dragged him roughly into an empty, windowless storage shed. I walked in right behind them and locked the heavy wooden door. Evans stumbled backward against a stack of hay bales, his eyes darting frantically between the two towering security guards and me. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project an authority he absolutely did not possess. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trembling, despite his best efforts. "You are assaulting a licensed medical professional. I am calling the police immediately." I did not raise my voice. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket, pulled up the audio file from the home office, and hit play. The clear, undeniable sound of Monica and Derek discussing his illegal off-the-books medical treatments filled the small shed. We listened to them joke about how easily he supplied the heavy narcotics for a massive cut of the $15 million land sale. The color instantly drained from the doctor's face. His arrogant posture crumbled into complete pathetic terror. "You are not a medical professional," I said, stepping closer until I was inches from his face. "You are a mercenary with a prescription pad. You are currently looking at decades in a federal penitentiary for medical malpractice, narcotics distribution, and conspiracy to commit major fraud. But if you do exactly what I tell you for the next 10 minutes, I might just let you walk away with a plea deal." The coward broke immediately. He did not even try to defend himself. He dropped his expensive medical bag onto the dirt floor and fell to his knees, begging for leniency, swearing he was only following Monica's orders to keep my son quiet. I felt a profound sense of disgust watching this man crumble so quickly. He had willingly destroyed a human mind for cash, and now he was weeping like a child to save his own skin. I ordered him to open his bag. I stood directly over him as he physically removed the heavy sedatives he had prepared for Leo. Under the strict, watchful eyes of my private medical team, I forced Dr. Evans to fill a new syringe with nothing but pure, harmless saline. We marched him out of the shed and straight into the freezing barn. Leo was curled on the filthy mattress, barely conscious, trapped in his medicated fog. I forced the corrupt doctor to administer the useless saline injection, maintaining the visual illusion that the daily schedule had been kept perfectly intact, just in case Monica checked the hidden security logs later. As soon as Evans pulled the needle away, Victor's men dragged him out of the barn and threw him into the back of a secure transport van. He would be held in absolute isolation until Friday night. With the immediate threat completely removed, my private trauma doctors moved in to save my boy. They set up a battery-powered medical station right there in the dirt. They worked with rapid, silent precision. They found a clean vein in Leo's badly bruised arm and started a specialized intravenous drip. The clear bags were filled with aggressive hydration fluids and powerful counteragents specifically designed to bind to the heavy sedatives and completely flush the dangerous toxins out of his bloodstream. I sat on the frozen concrete floor, holding my son's cold hand, while the medicine flowed steadily into his body. The lead doctor knelt beside me carefully, monitoring Leo's vitals on a portable digital screen. He told me the chemical damage was severe, but thankfully not permanent. The detox process would be grueling. It would take at least 24 hours for the deep narcotic fog to completely lift from his brain. We had to leave him here in the barn overnight to maintain the massive deception, but he would wake up entirely clear-headed just in time for the Friday night gala. I gently kissed my son's forehead, wrapped him tightly in a heavy thermal blanket we brought, and slipped back into the dark woods, fully ready for the final reckoning. The brutal cold of the Montana night no longer bothered me. I walked through the deep snow with renewed purpose. Every step brought me closer to destroying the parasites who had taken over my home. Tomorrow, the nightmare would end. The foundation of their lies was already cracking, and I held the ultimate sledgehammer in my hand. Friday morning broke with a piercing blue Montana sky that reflected blindingly off the fresh snow. I parked my rental car on the hidden logging road and began the 3-mile hike through the frozen pine forest. My muscles burned with a deep exhaustion, but pure adrenaline pushed me forward. I kept my movements slow and calculated, utilizing the thick tree line to completely obscure my approach to the western boundary of the estate. I reached the heavy wooden door of the horse stables just before 10 in the morning. I knew the security guard was stationed at the front gates, managing the arrival of catering trucks, setting up for Monica's lavish celebration. The courtyard was completely empty. I slipped my wire behind the steel latch, popped the bolt, and stepped quietly into the freezing corridor of the barn. I held my breath as I walked toward the final stall, mentally preparing myself for whatever state my son might be in. I turned the corner and looked down. Leo was not lying down. He was sitting bolt upright, his thin back pressed firmly against the rough wooden planks of the stall. The tattered blanket was draped over his shoulders, but he was no longer shivering with that terrifying tremor. He was staring directly at the barn door, his posture tense and incredibly alert. When his eyes locked onto mine, I stopped completely in my tracks. The thick haze that had suffocated his mind yesterday was gone. His pupils were normal. His gaze was sharp, focused, and entirely present. The heavy silence stretched between us. Then Leo let out a fractured, suffocating gasp. "Dad," he whispered. The word tore from his throat, completely shattered and raw with absolute, undeniable disbelief. "It is me, Leo," I said softly, stepping fully into the dim light of the wooden stall. "I am right here. I am finally home." He scrambled up from the freezing dirt floor, his legs shaking violently. He threw himself across the narrow space, collapsing against my chest. I caught him in my arms, wrapping my heavy winter coat around his frail frame. He buried his face into my shoulder and broke down into agonizing sobs. He cried with the desperate relief of a drowning man pulled from the ocean. I held him tighter than I had ever held anything in my life, letting my own silent tears fall freely. "I am so sorry," he choked out, his fingers gripping my coat. "I am so sorry, Dad. I was weak. I could not stop them. I tried to fight, but they took my mind." "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for," I said firmly, pulling him back just enough to look directly into his clear, tear-filled eyes. "You survived. That is all that matters right now. You held the line when no one else was coming for you. Tell me exactly what they did to you, Leo. Tell me everything." He wiped his dirty sleeve across his face, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. He told me the horrifying truth of his captivity. It was a meticulously planned, hostile takeover orchestrated by his own wife. 2 years ago, Monica quietly introduced him to Derek, claiming he was an agricultural investor interested in expanding the ranch. Derek started coming around the property constantly. Slowly, Leo began feeling strange. He experienced bouts of extreme dizziness, terrifying memory lapses, and crushing lethargy. He thought he was developing a severe neurological condition. He did not realize Monica was slipping potent sedatives into his meals. As his cognitive functions deteriorated, she brought in Dr. Evans. The physician diagnosed him with rapid-onset schizophrenia. When Leo tried to resist Derek and the security team restrained him, they locked him in the master bedroom, injecting him with massive doses of chemical restraints. Using fraudulent evaluations, Monica petitioned a corrupt judge and stripped Leo of his legal autonomy. She claimed full power of attorney to manage his financial affairs. Once she had legal authority, she banished him to the unheated horse stables, treating him worse than an animal. They held him hostage on the land I had purchased for him, forcing him to perform manual labor to break his spirit and ensure compliance. The only reason they kept him alive was because the massive lithium deposit required a final signature from the original deed holder to clear the title. I placed my hands firmly on Leo's shoulders, forcing him to look me squarely in the eyes. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. "I need you to dry your tears right now. Crying is for victims, and as of this exact moment, you are no longer a victim. Tonight, we do not just stop the sale of this ranch. Tonight, we become the executioners." Leo swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, as the initial wave of emotional relief hardened into something much darker and far more resilient. He nodded slowly, wiping the last remaining tears from his hollow cheeks. "What do we do, Dad?" he asked, his voice steadying with a newfound dangerous clarity. I outlined the exact uncompromising sequence of events for the evening. I told him about the $15 million gala Monica was currently setting up in the main house. I explained the micro-audio transmitters, the impending real estate transaction with the mining conglomerate, and the federal task force Victor Reed had quietly assembled in the shadows. But I also gave him the most difficult task of all. "You cannot walk out of this barn yet," I instructed. "You must stay exactly where you are. When the guards check on you, you must pretend to be sedated. Play the role of the broken zombie perfectly until the very last second." Monica and Derek need to believe they hold all the cards. They need to stand in that grand hall tonight, surrounded by their elite friends, and believe they have absolutely won. "You will not move until I give the signal. When the doors to that hall open, you will walk in, and you will take your empire back." Leo looked around the freezing, filthy stall that had been his personal prison for months. He looked at the rusted shovel leaning against the concrete wall, the dirty mattress, and the heavy padlock on the door. Then he looked back at me, the blood of our family finally running hot and fearless in his veins. "I will be ready, Dad," he said, his tone as cold and unforgiving as the Montana wind outside. "Let them have their party." I nodded, deeply satisfied with the lethal resolve I saw burning in my son's eyes. I turned and slipped back out through the side door of the barn, securing the heavy latch one final time. I walked back into the dark tree line, the morning sun now sitting high in the clear winter sky. The board was not just set anymore. The final trap was heavily baited, the exits were securely barricaded, and the executioners were simply waiting for the music to start. Friday evening arrived with a biting chill that perfectly matched the ice running through my veins. I parked my rental car near the edge of the sprawling driveway, watching the orchestrated chaos of Monica's grand deception unfold. The main house of the Bozeman estate had been completely transformed. It was no longer a home. It was a theatrical stage designed to project absolute, untouchable wealth. Valets in crisp white shirts hurried back and forth, parking a steady stream of luxury sedans and imported sports cars. The expansive front windows glowed with warm golden light, casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn. Through the glass, I could see the grand hall bustling with elite business people, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. Caterers in black uniforms wove seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive imported champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant, sophisticated soundtrack to the ultimate betrayal. At the center of it all stood Monica. She was wearing a stunning floor-length red designer gown that clung perfectly to her figure. Her hair was styled immaculately, and a heavy diamond necklace glittered against her collarbone. She was playing the role of the perfect, gracious hostess with terrifying, flawless precision. She glided from group to group, laughing lightly, touching arms, and projecting the image of a devoted wife bravely holding her family empire together. Standing just a few feet away from her was Derek. He looked incredibly smug in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He was currently engaged in deep conversation with three older men in expensive gray suits. I recognized their posture immediately. They carried thick leather briefcases and stood with the predatory confidence of corporate sharks. These were the representatives from the international mining conglomerate. The men who had come to purchase the newly discovered $15 million lithium deposit, resting quietly beneath my son's freezing prison. They were simply waiting for the final signatures to clear the title and steal my legacy. I sat in the dark interior of my vehicle, taking one final deep breath to steady my racing heart. I reached over and adjusted the cuffs of my shirt. I was no longer playing the role of the fragile, exhausted old man who had coughed his way through a pathetic lunch 2 days ago. That pathetic version of William Crawford had died in the freezing dirt of the horse stables. Tonight I was dressed in a bespoke heavy charcoal suit that I had purchased specifically for this occasion. My posture was completely straight, my shoulders pulled back, and my gaze was entirely devoid of mercy. I stepped out of the car, feeling the crunch of the frozen gravel beneath my polished leather shoes. A black luxury SUV pulled up smoothly right behind me. The heavy doors opened, and Victor Reed stepped out into the freezing air. My corporate attorney looked like a lethal weapon wrapped in expensive silk. He carried a slim leather portfolio tucked securely under his left arm. Emerging from the vehicle right behind him were two large, imposing men wearing dark, nondescript suits and subtle earpieces. They possessed the quiet, unmistakable intensity of federal agents. We did not speak a single word to each other. The plan was already locked in place. We walked together up the wide stone steps leading to the main entrance of the house. The heavy mahogany double doors were propped wide open to welcome the elite guests. I stepped across the threshold, allowing the warm, ambient light and the soft classical music to wash over me. I stood at the top of the grand foyer staircase looking down at the crowded hall. It only took 30 seconds for the dynamic of the room to shift. A few local business owners who actually remembered me from a decade ago stopped talking. Their eyes widened in surprise as they nudged their companions. The ripple effect was immediate. A sudden noticeable hush began to spread through the crowd as heads turned toward the grand entrance. Monica was in the middle of laughing at a joke made by one of the mining executives when she noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy. She turned her head, her fake, radiant smile still plastered across her face. Then her eyes locked directly onto mine. The transformation was instantaneous and deeply satisfying to witness. The color completely vanished from her cheeks. Her mouth hung open slightly, the polished facade cracking violently under the weight of sheer, unadulterated panic. She had expected to see a shuffling, coughing, senile old man, whom she could easily parade around as a tragic prop. Instead, she was looking at a formidable, commanding patriarch, flanked by a ruthless attorney and two heavily armed federal operatives. She immediately abandoned her conversation with the executives, excusing herself with a frantic, disjointed whisper. She practically sprinted across the polished hardwood floor, her red gown billowing behind her. She reached the bottom of the staircase just as I descended the final step. "William," she hissed, her voice a desperate, terrified whisper, intended only for my ears. Her manicured hands fluttered anxiously, desperately, wanting to grab my arm and pull me away from the crowd, but she was too intimidated by the men standing behind me to actually make physical contact. "What are you wearing? Why do you have these people with you? I thought you were just coming to have a quiet drink and celebrate our family." She was visibly trembling, her eyes darting nervously toward the mining executives, who were now watching our tense interaction with clear curiosity. "You need to come with me to the back study right now," she pleaded, trying to force a bright, welcoming smile for the watching guests, while her voice dripped with quiet venom. "Leo is having a terrible night in his facility, and we need to keep this very low-key. The buyers are currently reviewing the final paperwork, and any sudden disruptions could ruin the entire financial rescue plan. Please, William, do not make a scene. Just go to the study and wait for me." I looked down at her terrified, scheming face. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no hesitation, no warmth for the woman who married my son. She was a parasite trying to protect the host she was draining dry. I did not whisper back. I did not lower my voice. "I am not going anywhere near a back study, Monica," I said, my voice calm, deep, and carrying a resonant authority. "I am going to walk right over to that table." I stepped past her, brushing my shoulder against hers with cold indifference. Derek hurried toward us, his face flushed with sudden anger. "Mr. Crawford, I must insist you give us space," he said loudly. Victor stepped forward, inserting himself between us. "If you attempt to impede my client," Victor said calmly, "you will be restrained by federal agents and charged with assault. I strongly suggest you step aside." Derek swallowed hard, looking at the operatives. He stepped backward. I continued walking straight toward the center of the grand hall, my eyes locked on the documents. I kept my eyes locked on the long mahogany table positioned at the far end of the grand hall. The mining executives were gathered around it in a tight, professional circle. They had spread out several thick stacks of legal documents across the polished wood. The ambient lighting from the crystal chandeliers overhead cast a warm glow on the crisp white paper. Monica was standing at the center of the table, leaning forward with an eager, breathless posture. Derek was standing right next to her, reaching into the inner pocket of his midnight blue tuxedo. He pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He held it out to Monica with a sickeningly triumphant smile. The final signature was the only thing standing between them and $15 million. I did not alter my pace. I walked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, forcing the wealthy guests to part and make way for me. I felt the luxurious fabric of my bespoke suit brushing against my skin, a stark reminder that I was no longer the broken, shivering man they thought they had easily discarded. The string quartet in the corner was playing a soft, classical piece completely oblivious to the impending destruction. I approached a small, elevated wooden podium, set up near the head table for the evening toasts. A silver microphone stood perfectly positioned in the center. I stepped up onto the low platform. The wooden floorboards groaned slightly under my weight. I picked up a crystal champagne flute from a passing waiter and grabbed a silver butter knife from a nearby appetizer tray. I held the microphone close to my mouth and tapped the silver blade against the rim of the crystal glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the crowded room like a physical blade. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Hundreds of conversations died out instantly. Every single face in the grand hall turned to look directly at me. Derek froze with the gold pen still extended in his hand. Monica whipped her head around, her eyes wide with absolute horror. I looked out over the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system filling every corner of the massive room. "I am William Crawford. I am the original purchaser of this magnificent estate, and the father of the man you all believe is currently running it. I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but before any official documents are signed tonight, I felt it was absolutely necessary to say a few brief words about the current management of this ranch." Monica immediately realized what was happening. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The elegant, sophisticated persona she had crafted so carefully shattered into a million pieces. She dropped her designer clutch onto the floor and began waving her hands frantically toward the back of the room. She was desperately trying to signal the hired disc jockey stationed near the catering doors. She mouthed the words to cut the microphone, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. The young disc jockey reached for his soundboard, his fingers hovering over the master volume dial to silence me. But before he could even touch the controls, Victor Reed materialized out of the shadows right beside him. My attorney simply placed his hand firmly over the young man's wrist. Victor leaned in and whispered something into his ear. I did not need to hear the words to know they were highly intimidating. The disc jockey instantly pulled his hands away from the soundboard and took 2 large steps backward, raising his hands in absolute surrender. The microphone remained perfectly live. I held complete and total control over the entire room. The mining executives standing at the mahogany table exchanged very confused, highly concerned glances. The lead executive, a tall man with silver hair, slowly pulled his hand away from the legal documents. He took a cautious step backward, sensing that a catastrophic legal liability was about to unfold right in front of him. He quickly signaled to his colleagues, warning them to step away from the table immediately. The atmosphere in the grand hall shifted from festive celebration to suffocating tension. The wealthy guests held their breath, completely paralyzed by the sudden dramatic confrontation happening right before their eyes. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit and pulled out my mobile phone. I had already paired the device with the main house Bluetooth network earlier in the afternoon, while Monica was out dress shopping. I held the phone up high so the entire room could clearly see the glowing screen. "We are all gathered here tonight to celebrate the success and longevity of this beautiful property." I continued, keeping my voice incredibly calm and measured. "But true success requires complete transparency. I think it is only fair that the prospective buyers fully understand exactly how the current management team conducts their daily business operations." I looked directly into Monica's terrified eyes. I saw her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I tapped the screen of my phone and pressed play. The high-definition audio file began to broadcast through the massive speaker system. The crisp, undeniable voice of Derek filled the dead-silent hall. He was complaining about my son, whining about how Leo was resisting the final secondary deed release. He sounded irritated, callous, and utterly devoid of basic human empathy. Then Monica's voice echoed through the room, clear and chillingly cruel. The guests listened in collective horrified shock as she laughed about hiring an unlicensed physician to double Leo's dosage of chemical sedatives. The sound of them pouring champagne and celebrating my son's chemical lobotomy was crystal clear. The mining executives physically backed away from the table as the recording continued to play. The audio captured Monica casually mentioning my unexpected arrival at the ranch. She referred to me as a loose end that needed to be permanently tied up. The entire grand hall listened as the woman in the stunning red gown openly discussed staging a fatal hunting accident to ensure I would not interfere with their $15 million payday. She coldly calculated the logistics of murdering her father-in-law to secure a massive financial windfall. The horrific words bounced off the high vaulted ceilings, stripping away every single layer of their glamorous fake reality. Gasps of disbelief and murmurs of sheer disgust erupted from the wealthy crowd. People began to step away from Monica, treating her as if she carried a highly contagious disease. I stood perfectly still at the podium, watching the absolute destruction of their criminal empire unfold in real time. The trap had sprung with devastating perfection. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The carefully constructed walls of their deceit were burning to the ground in front of the most powerful people in the state. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction knowing my son was finally being avenged. The reckoning had fully arrived. The final echo of my daughter-in-law coldly calculating my murder faded into the cavernous space of the grand hall. The heavy silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Not a single person moved or dared to breathe. The elegant string quartet in the corner remained completely frozen, their bows resting awkwardly against their silent instruments. The wealthy guests stood paralyzed, their champagne flutes suspended in midair, staring in unadulterated horror at the woman in the stunning red gown. The lead executive from the international mining conglomerate stared blankly at the glowing screen of my mobile phone, his expression shifting from confusion to profound legal terror. He slowly lowered his gold fountain pen, placing it onto the polished mahogany table as if the metal was radioactive. He took a very deliberate, calculated step backward, signaling his colleagues to do exactly the same. They physically distanced themselves from the fraudulent legal documents, wanting no part of the criminal conspiracy that had just been broadcast to the entire room. The lead executive quickly snapped his expensive leather briefcase shut and locked the dual metal clasps with a sharp, resounding click. He glared at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust before turning his back on the disgraced broker, entirely silently severing all business ties. Monica stood completely rigid at the head of the table. The blood had entirely drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her skin a sickening chalky white. Her hands trembled violently as she looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic face among the elite crowd. She found absolutely nothing but deep disgust and quiet condemnation. The facade of her luxurious life was disintegrating right before her eyes, and the terror of her impending downfall was radiating from her every pore. I kept my posture straight, my expression devoid of any mercy, watching the parasitic foundation of her empire turn to dust. But Monica was a creature of intense manipulation, and cornered predators will always strike blindly when they have no avenue of escape. She let out a sudden, high-pitched laugh that sounded completely unhinged. She clapped her hands together, a desperate theatrical gesture designed to break the crippling tension in the room. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, forcing a wide, trembling smile as she looked pleadingly at the mining executives. "Do you see what I have to deal with every single day? Please do not listen to a word of this nonsense. This is exactly what the doctors warned us about." My poor father-in-law has been suffering from severe elder-onset dementia since he returned from Africa. His mind is completely gone." She pointed an accusing finger directly at me, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "That audio is completely fake," she shouted to the crowd, her chest heaving with exertion. "It is a sick, artificially generated deepfake. He hired some computer technician to splice our voices together because he is completely paranoid and delusional. He hates that I am trying to save his son from financial ruin. He is a sick, senile old man who has lost his grip on reality. You must believe me." She looked around frantically, but the wealthy guests merely took another collective step backward. Her desperate lies were incredibly transparent. The cruelty captured in that high-definition recording could never be faked, and the sheer panic radiating from her trembling body only cemented her absolute guilt. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I just stood at the podium and let the heavy, suffocating silence highlight her pathetic, frantic desperation. While Monica tried to lie her way out of a federal conspiracy, Derek correctly realized that the $15 million deal was completely dead. The real estate broker dropped his facade of sophisticated confidence and immediately shifted into sheer panic. He knew that the audio recording did not just ruin the land sale, it provided explicit, undeniable proof of his direct involvement in narcotic distribution and attempted murder. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the mahogany table. He desperately grabbed the thick stacks of legal contracts. "We are leaving," he hissed at Monica, grabbing her wrist roughly. "This entire negotiation is compromised. We need to go right now." He turned and marched briskly toward the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the hall. But Victor Reed had anticipated this exact maneuver. My attorney subtly nodded his head. The two massive federal operatives in plainclothes stepped smoothly out of the shadows, physically blocking the exit with their imposing frames. Derek stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting wildly toward the front doors, only to see uniformed security personnel stepping inside the foyer. "Do not touch me," Derek yelled, his voice cracking with fear. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Someone call the ranch security right now. Throw this crazy old man off the property. He has no legal right to be here. He is trespassing on private land. Arrest him immediately." He looked frantically at the mining executives, expecting them to support his false authority. Instead, the executives remained perfectly silent, wanting absolutely no involvement with the screaming, terrified fraudster cornered near the exit. I stepped down from the wooden podium, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the grand hall. The crowd parted seamlessly, creating a wide, unobstructed path between myself and the two cornered criminals. Derek continued to shout hollow threats, demanding my immediate removal, clinging to the desperate illusion that he still possessed some form of legal authority over my family land. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a thick, folded legal document. I held it up for the entire room to see. "You are absolutely correct about one thing, Derek," I said. "Legal authority is the only thing that matters in a transaction of this magnitude. But you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood the foundation of this property." I turned my gaze directly to Monica. Her eyes were fixed on the document in my hand, welling with fresh, genuine tears of absolute defeat. 12 years ago, when I purchased this $3.2 million estate as a gift for my son, I did not just sign a standard deed transfer, I stated clearly. I have spent my entire life engineering structures designed to withstand catastrophic failure. I applied that exact same rigorous methodology to my family trust. I structured the original deed with a very specific, irrevocable contingency clause. I took a slow step closer, enjoying the profound terror radiating from her pale face. The clause explicitly states that in the event of Leo suffering any form of severe medical incapacitation or loss of cognitive autonomy, the ownership of this land does not transfer to his spouse. It immediately and irrevocably reverts 100% back to me. Therefore, your fraudulently obtained power of attorney is completely null and void. You do not own a single blade of grass on this ranch. You never did. You have absolutely nothing to sell. The absolute finality of my words crashed down upon them like a concrete vault. The checkmate was utterly flawless, legally binding, and completely devastating. The sheer finality of my statement hung heavily in the freezing air of the grand hall. I watched the color drain completely from Monica's face as the terrifying reality of her shattered empire crashed down. But desperate cornered predators do not surrender without a fight. They lash out with everything they have left. She took an aggressive step forward, her manicured hands balled into tight fists. Her voice rose into a shrill, piercing scream that echoed violently across the silent room. She yelled that my document meant absolutely nothing. She pointed a trembling finger at me and shouted to the bewildered crowd that I was a manipulative liar trying to maliciously steal her husband's estate. She turned frantically toward the stunned mining executives, desperate to salvage the $15 million deal slipping through her fingers. She insisted that they ignore me. She claimed she had mountains of certified medical records signed by top-tier psychiatric specialists, proving beyond any doubt that Leo was permanently and legally insane. Her chest heaved as she lost her carefully crafted composure. She shrieked that my son was a helpless vegetable, a mindless, violent addict who could not even feed himself without her constant supervision. She swore to the buyers that her power of attorney was utterly ironclad, and that no ancient contingency clause could ever override the current medical consensus. Her voice cracked with frantic energy as she begged the executives to just look at the clinical evaluations she had provided. She demanded that the security detail throw me out immediately so they could finalize the transaction. She was completely unraveling right in front of them, entirely unaware that her hysterical screaming only proved her undeniable guilt to the horrified guests watching her public meltdown. The mining executives looked at her with pure disgust, unwilling to entertain her frantic delusions for another second. But before the lead executive could articulate a formal response to her demands, a heavy, resounding thud echoed loudly from the back of the massive room. The towering solid oak doors of the grand foyer swung slowly and deliberately open, their heavy brass hinges groaning deeply in the suffocating silence. Every single head in the entire room turned simultaneously toward the main entrance. A tall, imposing silhouette stood framed perfectly in the warm light of the grand hallway. The man took a slow, measured step forward, confidently crossing the threshold into the opulent ballroom. The wealthy guests nearest the door gasped collectively, stepping backward in shock to clear a wide, unobstructed path. It was Leo. He was no longer the emaciated, shivering prisoner I had found desperately shoveling horse manure in the freezing dirt of the stables. The tattered rags and the overgrown beard were completely gone. He was impeccably dressed in a sharp, beautifully tailored navy blue suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His face was entirely clean-shaven, revealing the strong, handsome features that had been cruelly buried under months of forced neglect and systematic chemical abuse. The deep, dark circles under his eyes had faded significantly, replaced by a fierce, undeniable intensity that demanded absolute attention. He walked with a steady, incredibly powerful stride, his upright posture radiating an unwavering confidence. The suffocating fog of the heavy illicit sedatives had entirely lifted from his mind. He was completely lucid, perfectly aware, and radiating a furious, focused clarity that instantly commanded the immediate respect of every single person standing in that room. He looked exactly like a king returning home to reclaim his stolen throne. The absolute silence that fell over the expansive grand hall was profound. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, authoritative click of Leo's polished leather shoes striking against the pristine hardwood floor. The wealthy guests parted seamlessly as he approached, creating a wide, unobstructed avenue down the center of the room. They watched in sheer awe as the very man Monica had just loudly declared a mindless vegetable walked right past them with perfect grace and unyielding strength. I stood silently near the wooden podium, lowering my hands and stepping back to allow my son to take his rightful place at the center of the battlefield. I watched the profound shock ripple violently across Derek's face. The corrupt real estate broker stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the polished mahogany table. He was completely paralyzed by the impossible sight of his former captive walking freely among the elite crowd. But Monica's reaction was far more visceral and revealing. As Leo continued his steady, unrelenting march directly toward her, her knees visibly buckled under her own weight. She let out a weak, strangled gasp, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth. She stared at him with eyes wide with absolute primal terror. She looked exactly as if she were watching a vengeful ghost rise from a shallow grave she had personally dug. She stumbled backward in sheer panic, her expensive designer heels catching on the heavy fabric of her red silk gown. She collided roughly with a tall floral arrangement, sending a crystal vase crashing loudly to the floor. But she did not even blink at the noise. She was completely trapped in the terrifying reality that her victim had broken his chemical chains. Leo did not break eye contact with her for a single second as he closed the remaining distance. Leo stopped exactly 3 feet away from his terrified, shaking wife. He looked down at her shivering form with an expression of pure, concentrated ice. There was no trace of the broken, weeping boy I had held tightly in the freezing barn just a few short hours ago. He stood tall, like a formidable force of nature unleashed upon his tormentors. Monica tried to speak, her pale lips moving silently, as she searched for a plausible lie that could explain away his sudden, miraculous recovery. But no words came out of her mouth. She was suffocated by the overwhelming weight of her own undeniable guilt. Leo did not offer her a single syllable of acknowledgement. He smoothly shifted his piercing gaze away from her trembling face and looked directly at the tight circle of mining executives standing defensively near the table. He reached out and calmly placed his hand flat against the tall stacks of fraudulent legal documents they had prepared for the massive sale. He looked directly at the lead executive, his voice steady, deeply resonant, and carrying an absolute, unquestionable authority that echoed perfectly through the dead, silent room. "My name is Leo Crawford," he said, speaking slowly and deliberately, so that every single guest in the grand hall could hear his words clearly. "I am the sole legal owner of this ranch, and I am of a perfectly sound mind. There will be no sale taking place here tonight, and these fraudulent contracts you have prepared are entirely worthless." He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen Derek had left sitting on the table and casually tossed it onto the hardwood floor. The sharp metallic clatter served as the final definitive punctuation to their sprawling criminal conspiracy. The family empire had been officially reclaimed, and the traitors were finally standing completely defenseless in the blazing light of truth. The sharp clatter of the gold fountain pen against the hardwood floor sounded like the final gavel striking in a courtroom. The mining executives did not say a single word. They simply backed further away from the mahogany table, looking at my son with a mixture of profound shock and undeniable respect. Leo stood there, like an immovable mountain, radiating an absolute quiet authority that completely shattered the pathetic narrative Monica had spent years building. The room was so quiet I could hear the heavy, frantic breathing of my daughter-in-law. She was trembling violently, her eyes darting back and forth between her resurrected husband and the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. Her grand illusion had collapsed, but her arrogant, predatory nature simply refused to accept total defeat. Instead of surrendering, she doubled down on her horrific lies. She let out a desperate, shrill cry and pointed a shaking finger at Leo. She told the crowd that this was exactly what she had warned them about. She shrieked that this sudden clarity was nothing more than a dangerous, temporary, lucid interval caused by his severe schizophrenia. She begged the executives not to be fooled by his calm demeanor, insisting that a violent, psychotic break was absolutely imminent. She spun around wildly, her beautiful red designer gown twisting around her ankles, searching the crowded room for the one man who could validate her sick fantasy. She began screaming for Dr. Evans. She demanded that the physician step forward immediately to verify her fraudulent medical claims and explain her husband's condition to the terrified buyers. Her voice cracked with sheer hysteria as she called his name over and over again, demanding his professional intervention. Her frantic cries echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, but no one stepped out from the crowd to rescue her. The wealthy socialites and local politicians only shrank further back into the shadows, deeply uncomfortable with her public unraveling. I stood quietly near the podium and offered a brief, subtle nod to Victor Reed. My corporate attorney adjusted his tailored jacket, a cold, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. He walked slowly toward the heavy wooden side doors that led directly into the private study. Monica paused her frantic shouting, watching Victor with eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing dread. She realized too late that she had just walked blindly into another trap. Victor firmly grasped the brass handles and pulled the heavy doors wide open. The ambient light from the grand hall spilled into the darkened study, illuminating the absolute ruin of her escape plan. Standing just inside the doorway was the corrupt, unlicensed physician who had traded his medical oath for a share of her stolen fortune. Dr. Evans was trembling uncontrollably, his head bowed in deep, pathetic shame. His expensive designer coat looked rumpled and dirty from his time spent locked inside the freezing storage shed. But it was not his disheveled appearance that made the remaining color completely drain from Monica's face. It was the heavy steel handcuffs locking his wrists tightly together behind his back. He was flanked on either side by the two imposing plainclothes federal operatives, who now openly displayed their gleaming silver badges pinned to their belts. The visual impact of the captured mercenary completely eradicated any lingering doubt in the room. The two federal agents placed their hands firmly on the doctor's shoulders and marched him out of the study, forcing him to stand squarely in the harsh, revealing light of the grand ballroom. Dr. Evans looked absolutely broken. He was a coward who had only ever possessed courage when his victims were heavily sedated and entirely defenseless. Now faced with the terrifying, unavoidable reality of spending the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, he was more than willing to betray his wealthy accomplices to save his own skin. One of the federal agents instructed him to speak clearly for the room to hear. Dr. Evans swallowed hard, keeping his tear-filled eyes firmly fixed on the hardwood floor. He could not even look at Leo. His voice shook violently as he began his public, utterly humiliating confession. He admitted right there in front of the horrified elite guests and the stunned mining executives that Leo had never suffered from any form of mental illness. He confessed that he had been routinely supplying highly restricted, extremely powerful chemical sedatives to Monica on a daily basis. He meticulously detailed how they had deliberately orchestrated a systematic poisoning campaign to artificially induce the symptoms of aggressive schizophrenia. He admitted to explicitly forging the psychiatric evaluations and falsifying complex medical records to help Monica illegally secure her fraudulent power of attorney. The crowd gasped in collective horror as the true depth of their profound cruelty was laid bare. But Dr. Evans was not finished. He revealed the exact financial motive driving his dark betrayal. He confessed that Monica and Derek had explicitly promised him a direct, untraceable payment of $500,000, which was his agreed-upon cut of the impending $15 million land sale. The entire room stared at Monica as if she were a literal monster wearing a silk gown. Her absolute destruction was complete, public, and utterly undeniable. There were no more lies to spin, no more false smiles to hide behind, and no more fake medical records to save her. But while Monica stood paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her exposure, Derek was operating purely on predatory survival instinct. The corrupt real estate broker realized the federal net had completely closed around them. He knew that the moment the authorities finished processing the disgraced doctor, he would be the very next person placed in heavy steel handcuffs. He slowly began to back away from the mahogany table, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive ballroom. He took a sudden step backward, turned and bolted toward the massive glass patio doors at the rear of the hall. He ran with the clumsy, terrified desperation of a hunted animal, violently shoving a catering waiter out of his way and sending a tray of crystal glasses shattering across the floor. He hit the heavy release bar on the patio doors, bursting out onto the snow-covered terrace and disappearing into the freezing darkness of the Montana night. Monica screamed his name, horrified that her accomplice was abandoning her to face the severe consequences alone. But Derek did not make it very far. He had completely failed to notice the subtle movement outside the tall windows. Local police units had silently surrounded the perimeter of the main house 10 minutes ago. The moment Derek's expensive leather shoes hit the frozen ground of the back lawn, 3 heavy flashlight beams illuminated him perfectly. A group of heavily armed uniformed officers surged forward from the deep shadows of the evergreen bushes. They intercepted him immediately, tackling him brutally to the ground. I stood quietly and watched through the large glass doors as the arrogant broker was shoved face first into the freezing snow, his hands forcefully yanked behind his back by the waiting police officers. The dark empire they had stolen had finally fallen completely. The heavy thud of Derek hitting the frozen ground outside was the final nail in the coffin of their sprawling conspiracy. Inside the grand hall, the suffocating silence broke. The 2 plainclothes federal agents who had escorted the disgraced doctor now turned their unwavering attention entirely toward Monica. They moved with absolute terrifying synchronicity, stepping deliberately across the polished hardwood floor. The heavy silver badges clipped to their belts caught the warm ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. Monica realized with crushing certainty that there was no hidden back door left to exploit. There was no clever lie that could possibly explain away the federal authorities bearing down on her. The sheer overwhelming gravity of her impending imprisonment finally shattered her arrogant posture. She let out a sudden guttural sob that tore through her throat, completely devoid of her usual theatrical grace. Her knees buckled violently beneath her. She collapsed directly onto the unforgiving floor, the expensive fabric of her stunning red designer gown pooling around her trembling legs like spilled blood. She threw her hands up her perfectly manicured fingers, shaking uncontrollably as the agents loomed over her. For the very first time since I had stepped onto this property, the tears streaming down her pale cheeks were absolutely genuine. They were born of pure, unadulterated terror. The agents firmly commanded her to place her hands behind her back, but she fiercely resisted the order, twisting her upper body away from their grasp. She crawled frantically across the floor, scraping her knees against the wood, desperate to close the distance between herself and my son. She reached out her fingers, desperately clutching at the meticulously tailored fabric of Leo's dark trousers. She looked up at the man she had systematically poisoned for years, her makeup completely ruined by her streaming tears. "Leo," she wept, her voice a pathetic high-pitched whine that echoed painfully through the silent ballroom. "Leo, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them this is a terrible mistake. I am your wife. We stood at the altar together and promised to love each other through everything. You promised to protect me. Please, baby, remember our vows. Remember the life we were supposed to build together. Do not let them take me away in chains. I did everything because I was scared of losing you. I love you. Please, Leo, just look at me and remember who we are." Leo did not take a single step backward. He stood perfectly still, allowing her frantic, grasping hands to pull desperately at the fabric of his suit. He looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman sobbing at his feet. His expression was not angry. It was far worse than anger. His face was carved from absolute impenetrable ice. The profound chemical fog that had clouded his beautiful mind for years was completely eradicated, replaced by an unbreakable, ruthless clarity. He did not see his loving wife pleading for mercy. He saw his warden. He saw the cruel architect of his personal hell. Monica continued to sob uncontrollably, begging him to intervene with the federal agents who were now stepping forward to physically restrain her. Leo slowly reached down and firmly grasped her trembling wrists. For a brief, fleeting second, Monica let out a breathless gasp of hope, falsely believing that her emotional manipulation had successfully pierced his hardened armor. She thought he was reaching down to help her up. Instead, he forcefully peeled her desperate fingers off his clothing, discarding her hands with a visceral, unmistakable disgust. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with hers. The room was so quiet that every single syllable he spoke resonated through the crowd with devastating precision. "You made me shovel horse manure in the freezing dirt while my mind was screaming in a chemical cage," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. You watched me wither away into nothing, and you smiled while you did it. You do not get to speak about our vows. You destroyed our vows the very first time you slipped poison into my food. You are nothing to me now. You are completely dead to me." He straightened his posture, towering over her broken form, and took a deliberate step backward. He looked directly at the two federal agents waiting patiently behind her. "She is all yours," he stated firmly. The absolute finality of his rejection was the final blow. Monica let out a devastating, ear-piercing shriek of pure despair. The agents immediately lunged forward, grabbing her by the arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked ruthlessly around her wrists, locking her permanently into the nightmare she had designed for my son. The authorities did not offer her a shred of dignity. The agents gripped her arms and began to march her aggressively down the wide center aisle of the grand ballroom. The wealthy elite of Bozeman, the people she desperately tried to impress, parted to create a wide path. They stared in horrified silence. The elegant socialites and local politicians pulled their expensive clothes out of her way, actively avoiding physical contact with a federal prisoner. Her public reputation was utterly obliterated. She sobbed hysterically, her diamond necklace swinging wildly against her collarbone as she was dragged through the sea of condemning faces. She begged the business owners for help, pleading with friends to call their lawyers, but every single person simply turned away in disgust. They watched the woman who played the perfect hostess be forcefully shoved through the front doors and out into the freezing night, disappearing forever into the flashing red lights of the waiting police cruisers. The tension inside the hall finally broke. The sheer panic in the room instantly transferred to the international mining executives. The men who had been eager to purchase the $15 million deposit realized how dangerously close they had come to participating in a massive criminal fraud. The lead executive scrambled toward the mahogany table. His hands shook as he hastily shoved the unexecuted legal contracts and geological surveys into his leather briefcase. He snapped the metal latches shut and practically sprinted toward where Leo and I were standing. His arrogant, predatory demeanor was entirely replaced by desperate, sweating subservience. "Mr. Crawford," he stammered, addressing both of us with a frantic, pleading tone. "I swear to you on my life our corporation had absolutely no knowledge of this horrific deception. We were told you were completely incapacitated. We operate strictly by the law. Please, you must believe we had no part in this kidnapping. We formally withdraw our purchasing offer immediately. We sincerely apologize for this intrusion." I looked at the sweating executive with a cold, unforgiving stare. "Leave this property right now," I commanded softly. The executive nodded vigorously, his face flushed with panic. He grabbed his associates by their shoulders, and the group of corporate sharks fled the grand hall as fast as their expensive shoes could carry them. The sprawling estate was finally purged of its parasites. We had finally reclaimed our stolen, beautiful family empire. The flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers slowly faded into the freezing Montana night. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand hall, watching the heavy mahogany double doors swing completely shut. The deafening chaos that had consumed the room just moments ago was entirely gone. There were no more panicked socialites scrambling for their expensive coats. There were no more frantic mining executives fleeing into the darkness. And most importantly, there were no more parasites left breathing the air inside my family home. The silence that settled over the sprawling estate was absolute and profoundly heavy. I turned slowly, taking in the sheer devastation shown of Monica's meticulously planned celebration. The opulent room was completely littered with the careless debris of a shattered empire. Half-empty crystal champagne flutes sat abandoned on the polished wooden tables. Silk napkins were thrown carelessly across the expensive floral arrangements. A silver tray of delicate appetizers lay overturned near the patio doors where Derek had desperately tried to escape. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a violent storm. But for the first time in years, the air inside this house actually felt clean. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the sharp, cold draft from the broken patio doors fill my lungs. My entire body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the grueling hike, the covert infiltration, and the public confrontation was finally beginning to ebb. My 70-year-old joints throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, but my mind was completely at peace. I had successfully engineered the total collapse of a massive criminal conspiracy without firing a single shot. I had used their own arrogant greed as the primary explosive, and I had simply provided the spark. I reached up and slowly unbuttoned the top button of my charcoal suit, allowing the suffocating tension of the evening to physically release from my shoulders. Victor Reed and his federal operatives had already stepped outside to finish coordinating the legal handover with the local authorities. I took a moment to compose myself before turning around. The battle was officially over, and the true healing process was now ready to begin. I was finally completely alone with my son. I turned my attention to Leo. He was standing near the far wall of the grand hall, staring blankly out the large bay windows into the pitch-black forest. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. The heavy navy blue suit he wore hung slightly loose on his emaciated frame, a stark visual reminder of the horrific physical toll the forced chemical sedation had taken on his body. I walked quietly across the scattered debris on the hardwood floor, stopping just a few feet away from him. I did not rush forward to pull him into a dramatic embrace. I knew from surviving brutal tragedies in Africa that immediate trauma does not simply vanish the moment the immediate threat is neutralized. The deep psychological wounds Monica had inflicted upon his mind would take months, perhaps even years, to fully heal. Rushing that delicate process would only cause more damage. Instead of offering hollow, comforting platitudes, I walked over to a small mahogany side table where a heavy crystal decanter of aged bourbon sat entirely untouched. I picked up 2 heavy glass tumblers and poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid into each one. The soft clinking of the crystal was the only sound in the room. I walked back over to Leo and silently extended one of the glasses toward him. He slowly turned his head away from the dark window and looked down at my hand. His eyes were red and swollen, carrying the distinct, haunting weight of a man who had just watched his entire reality burn to the ground. But behind the obvious exhaustion, there was a steady, undeniable flame of survival. He reached out and took the glass, his long fingers wrapping tightly around the crystal base. We walked together in perfect understanding silence toward the center of the room and sat down heavily on a pair of oversized leather sofas. I let out a long, ragged exhale as my body sank into the plush cushions. Leo mirrored my movement, letting his head fall back against the soft leather. He brought the glass to his lips and took a long, slow drink of the burning liquid. We sat there for a very long time, simply existing in the quiet shared space, finally able to breathe without the suffocating weight of deception pressing down on our chests. I placed my glass onto the low wooden coffee table and leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on my knees. I looked directly at the stack of abandoned legal contracts the mining executives had left behind in their frantic panic. The bright white paper glowed warmly under the crystal chandeliers, detailing the vast, untapped wealth buried deep beneath the frozen pastures outside. I looked back up at my son. "Tomorrow morning we start completely over," I said, keeping my voice low but infused with an unshakable, grounding authority. "We are going to clean the filth out of this house. We are going to purge every single trace of her existence from this property. And then we are going to get to work." Leo slowly lowered his glass, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. He listened intently, processing every word with a quiet, fierce concentration. I pointed a steady finger toward the discarded geological surveys. "We are not selling a single acre of this land to any corporate conglomerate," I stated firmly. "I did not spend 12 brutal years fighting malaria and building massive concrete infrastructure in the scorching Kenyan heat just to hand your legacy over to a boardroom of strangers. We are going to oversee the lithium extraction operations ourselves. We will hire our own private geologists, our own independent contractors, and our own loyal security teams. We are going to manage this entire process strictly on our own terms." I leaned back into the leather sofa, holding his gaze with absolute resolve. "We are going to build an empire right here in these mountains, Leo. And we are going to build it so strong, so fundamentally impenetrable, that no one will ever be able to steal it from you again." The heavy silence stretched between us for a fleeting moment. Then a profound, visible shift occurred within my son. The lingering shadows of fear and victimhood completely vanished from his handsome face. He sat up straight, squaring his broad shoulders with a newfound commanding strength. The undeniable resilience of the Crawford bloodline was finally permanently restored in his eyes. He raised his crystal glass toward me in a silent, solemn salute. "We build it together, Dad," he replied, his voice ringing with absolute lethal certainty. I raised my own glass to meet his, the heavy crystal clinking softly in the empty hall. The nightmare was finally over, and the dawn was approaching fast. We had survived the absolute worst, and now we would reclaim our entire future together, side by side. 6 months passed since that freezing night in the Grand Hall. The heavy winter had finally melted away, replaced by the bright sunlight of a Montana summer. But the atmosphere inside the federal courthouse in Helena felt entirely devoid of warmth. The high-vaulted room was constructed of polished dark oak and cold marble designed specifically to project the absolute weight of the law. I sat in the second row of the gallery, resting my hands quietly on my knees, waiting for the end. The air conditioning hummed with a low, sterile drone that muted the bustling traffic outside. I was not looking at the ornate woodwork or the towering seal of the justice system. My eyes were locked entirely on the defense table. Sitting there were two people I barely recognized. The stunning woman who had worn a brilliant red designer gown and paraded around my estate was gone. Monica had been entirely stripped of her stolen lifestyle. She wore a baggy bright orange canvas jumpsuit that swallowed her thin frame. The stiff fabric clearly offered no comfort against the rigid wooden chair. Her beautifully styled hair was now dull and pulled back into a messy knot at the nape of her neck. Without her expensive cosmetics, the devastating toll of the last 6 months was painted clearly across her face. Deep shadows bruised the delicate skin beneath her eyes. She sat with her shoulders hunched forward, staring blankly at the scarred wooden table, picking nervously at her cuticles. Sitting beside her was the man who had confidently planned to sell my legacy. Derek looked equally shattered. The slick real estate broker who had swaggered around my driveway in a tailored tuxedo was reduced to a slumping, defeated prisoner. His head hung so low his chin rested on his chest. He looked entirely terrified of the concrete walls that were about to close around him. I slowly turned my head and looked at the man sitting directly to my right. The contrast between my son and the two criminals sitting at the defense table was staggering. Leo was no longer the emaciated, shivering hostage I had found shoveling horse manure in the dark. The deep bruises had faded from his arms, and the suffocating chemical fog had been completely purged from his mind. He was wearing a meticulously tailored light gray suit, his posture straight and radiating a quiet strength. He had spent the last 6 months undergoing intensive physical therapy and deep psychological counseling, fighting with relentless determination to reclaim his body. He looked healthy, focused, and in control of his destiny. He did not look at his former wife with anger or sorrow. He looked at her with the cool, detached observation of a man viewing a stranger through a thick pane of glass. We sat shoulder to shoulder, presenting a united front, silently acknowledging the grueling battle we had successfully fought together. Victor Reed sat behind us, occasionally reviewing his legal notes, ensuring that the case of the prosecution remained utterly airtight and devastating. A sudden knock broke the quiet murmuring in the room, as the court bailiff loudly announced the arrival of the federal judge. Every person in the gallery rose to their feet in solemn respect. The judge, an imposing woman with silver hair and a stern expression, strode across the elevated platform and took her seat behind the massive wooden bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and stared down at the two broken individuals sitting at the defense table. She did not offer them a single ounce of pity. For the next 20 minutes, she meticulously summarized the astonishing depth of their sprawling criminal conspiracy. She spoke with a clear, resonant voice detailing exactly how Derek had manipulated commercial real estate laws to orchestrate a massive fraudulent land transfer. She highlighted the profound cruelty of a wife who had systematically poisoned her own husband. She detailed the forged psychiatric evaluations, the illicit narcotic distribution, and the horrific isolation they had used to strip a man of his basic human rights. Listening to the clinical legal recitation of their crimes made the air in the courtroom feel suffocating. Monica visibly flinched with every word, her body physically shrinking under the crushing weight of her public exposure. The judge finally closed the heavy leather binder resting on her desk. She folded her hands together, leaning forward to deliver the ultimate, inescapable hammer of justice. She addressed Derek first, stripping away his arrogant pride. She condemned his predatory greed and his blatant disregard for human life in pursuit of a massive financial windfall. She sentenced him to a mandatory, non-negotiable, 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and major criminal conspiracy. Derek let out a weak, pathetic sob, dropping his face entirely into his shaking hands. The judge then turned her piercing gaze directly onto Monica. She stated that in her 30 years on the judicial bench, she had rarely seen a betrayal so intimate, so calculated, and so profoundly evil. For the charges of kidnapping, severe elder abuse, and the illegal distribution of highly restricted narcotics, she sentenced Monica to 12 years in federal prison without any possibility of early parole. The sharp, authoritative crack of the heavy wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom, finalizing the absolute destruction of their pathetic lives. Two heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the carpeted floor. They ordered the defendants to stand. The distinct, terrifying sound of heavy steel chains and clicking handcuffs filled the vast room as their wrists and ankles were securely bound together. Monica was slowly pulled to her feet by the unyielding grip of the marshals. She turned her body toward the crowded gallery for the long, humiliating walk toward the holding cells. As she began to shuffle down the center aisle, her red, swollen eyes frantically scanned the faces of the people watching her absolute, devastating downfall unfold. She was desperately searching for a single ounce of sympathy. But as her gaze swept toward the right side of the room, she abruptly stopped. She saw Leo and me sitting perfectly still, watching her with absolute, unwavering clarity. She did not cry out. She did not beg for forgiveness. She simply squeezed her eyes tightly shut, deliberately, turning her face away toward the cold floor, completely unable to bear the overwhelming weight of our silent judgment. She refused to look at us as she was physically dragged away, step by agonizing step, into the darkness she entirely deserved. I watched the heavy wooden doors close firmly behind her, sealing her fate. I did not feel any sudden rush of triumphant joy. There was no warm, victorious celebration blooming in my chest today. Instead, I felt only the incredibly cold, clinical satisfaction of a highly skilled surgeon who had just successfully cut a malignant, deadly tumor out of a perfectly healthy body. The toxic rot that had threatened to consume my family was finally permanently eradicated. The devastating infection was completely gone forever. The surgical extraction was absolutely flawless, and true justice was entirely undeniably clinical. A full year has passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom closed on the darkest chapter of our lives. Today, the biting winter wind that once felt so cruel has been entirely replaced by the gentle golden warmth of a beautiful Montana summer. I am standing on the expansive wraparound porch of the main house, resting my hands against the sturdy wooden railing. The sprawling estate stretching out before me is practically unrecognizable from the desolate, fearful place I returned to 12 months ago. The ranch is absolutely thriving. The wide green pastures are vibrant and bursting with life, completely free of the toxic shadows that Monica had deliberately cast over this land. The air smells of fresh pine and sweet mountain grass, carrying the distinct, undeniable scent of a hard-won victory. We did not just survive the brutal betrayal. We rebuilt our entire world from the ashes, and we built it stronger than ever before. Down in the southern valley, carefully obscured behind a thick, natural barrier of towering evergreen trees, our lithium mining operation is running with flawless, quiet efficiency. We did not sell a single acre of our legacy to that greedy corporate conglomerate. Instead, Leo and I took complete control of our destiny. We spent months meticulously interviewing and hiring the best independent geologists, ethical project managers, and top-tier environmental engineers in the country. We established a strictly regulated, highly sustainable extraction process that protects the natural beauty of the land while generating a massive, steady stream of generational wealth. Every single contract is personally reviewed by Victor Reed. Every financial transaction is transparent and strictly monitored. We control the entire operation on our own uncompromising terms. The rare minerals buried deep beneath the frozen soil are no longer a hidden curse used to justify my son's torture. They are the solid, unbreakable foundation of our new empire. I hear the soft, familiar sound of heavy boots walking across the wooden porch boards behind me. I turn around and see my son. The transformation in Leo over the last year is nothing short of miraculous. He is wearing a simple plaid shirt and durable work jeans, his hands tucked comfortably into his pockets. He looks incredibly healthy, strong, and deeply at peace. The hollow, haunted look that once clouded his eyes has been completely eradicated. He spent the first few months after the arrests undergoing intense physical detoxification and rigorous psychological counseling. He fought through the terrible withdrawal symptoms and the lingering trauma with the fierce, unyielding resilience of a true survivor. He refused to let the horrific things done to him dictate the rest of his life. Today he walks his land with the quiet, formidable confidence of a man who has stared into the absolute abyss and emerged completely victorious. He is no longer a victim. He is the master of his own fate. Standing right beside Leo is a woman who brings a genuine, brilliant smile to my face. Her name is Sarah. She is a local veterinarian who specializes in large animal rehabilitation, and she came to the ranch 6 months ago to help us restore the neglected horse stables. She is bright, compassionate, and incredibly grounded. She does not wear heavy designer makeup or demand expensive diamond watches. She wears worn denim, has dirt on her boots, and loves my son for his resilient spirit, his kind heart, and his quiet strength. She does not care about the massive lithium fortune sitting in our bank accounts. She only cares about the man standing next to her. Leo recently proposed to her in the exact same restored barn where I had found him shivering in the dark. They are planning a simple, beautiful wedding for the fall, surrounded only by people who genuinely care for them. Watching them laugh together as they look out over the pasture fills my chest with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. The dark, suffocating chapter of Monica is completely closed, replaced by a bright, authentic love that cannot be bought or manipulated. Leo claps a strong hand on my shoulder, breaking me from my thoughts. He smiles, points toward the new herd of horses running freely across the distant field, and tells me that the ranch is finally exactly what we always dreamed it would be. I smile back, nodding in silent, absolute agreement. He leaves me to enjoy the morning view, walking down the porch steps with Sarah by his side. I turn my gaze back toward the towering snow-capped peaks of the Montana mountains. The profound stillness of the morning gives me space to truly reflect on the incredible, brutal journey that brought me to this exact moment. I think about the 12 grueling years I spent living in the blistering, unforgiving heat of the African continent. I remember the endless days spent fighting the sheer forces of nature. I battled raging rivers, devastating droughts, and deadly diseases to build aqueducts and bring clean water to desperate, isolated villages. I survived in a harsh, barren environment where the daily struggle for survival was raw, visible, and completely honest. In the wild savanna, predators do not hide their intentions. You can see the lions circling in the tall grass. You can hear the hyenas calling out in the dark. The threats are openly declared, and you prepare yourself accordingly. But returning home taught me a terrifying, completely different lesson about the true nature of survival. I realized that the most dangerous predators in this world do not live in the wild savanna. They do not hunt in the open plains or announce their presence with a roar. The most lethal predators sleep in our comfortable beds. They sit at our dinner tables pouring our wine and flashing perfect practiced smiles. They hide their venom behind designer clothes and sweet affectionate words. They use our own love, our own generous trust, as a weapon to slowly bleed us dry. I had spent over a decade fighting the harsh elements of a foreign continent to build a secure empire for my family, entirely oblivious to the fact that the real danger was already living inside my home. I had handed my son a kingdom, mistakenly believing that financial security would protect him from the evils of the world. I learned the hard way that wolves only win when the shepherd is asleep. I had been asleep, blindly trusting that the legal bonds of marriage and the comfort of extreme wealth would shield my boy from harm. I will never make that profound mistake again. The grueling battles I fought over the last year stripped away every remaining ounce of my naive idealism. I learned that true peace is not a passive state of existence. It must be fiercely, aggressively protected. You cannot simply build a fortress and assume the walls will hold forever. You must constantly patrol the perimeter. You must be willing to look closely at the people standing inside your gates. And most importantly, you must be fully prepared to become the absolute worst nightmare of anyone who dares to threaten the people you truly love the very most. 12 years in a barren continent taught me that survival requires vigilance, but returning home taught me that betrayal breeds in the comfort of luxury. We often build empires to protect our children from the world, only to realize we inadvertently invited the wolves directly into our pasture. True parental love is not about blinding trust. It is about having the ruthless courage to tear down the very walls you built, to eradicate the rot hiding inside. Never let your age or your love make you a willing victim. When the foundation is poisoned, you must wield the sledgehammer yourself. If this story proved that true justice requires a cold mind and a fearless heart, please hit that like button to support this channel. Subscribe now so you never miss another story of truth and redemption. Drop a comment below and tell me how you would handle this terrible betrayal.